The first lecture for week 10 is on the cerebellum. The cerebellum is often called the little brain because, like our cerebrum, it has two hemispheres. It's also important in multiple different types of functions. It's most well known for its involvement in motor, but it also has been found to have affective and cognitive functioning. The cerebellum is important in coordination of movement, giving us fine, smooth, controlled movement is one of its primary functions. It's also involved in maintaining normal muscle tone, along with a group of structures in the cerebrum known as the basal ganglia. And it's important in maintaining posture and balance with its connections to the vestibular system. The cerebellum predicts and adjusts movement to make sure that our goal-directed movements are smooth and on trajectory. The hallmark of the cerebellum is coordination. From the external eye, this appears as a smooth, controlled movement. It involves synergy, or contraction of muscles simultaneously, along with relaxation of other muscles simultaneously. It involves sequencing, having muscles turn on and turn off in the appropriate sequence in order to achieve the movement. It also involves precision, being on target, being reaching and getting to your target rather than off to one side. And force, having the appropriate force. You don't want too little, where you might crush the object you're going to grasp, but you also don't want too little, where you would drop the object you're hoping to hold. And timing, the timing that things turn on and turn off. So even if they're turning on and off in the right order, they also need to do so at the correct time. All of these together create a smooth, coordinated motion, and that is the cerebellum's territory. Here's an example of a coordinated versus uncoordinated movement. If you were going to connect two dots and have a nice, smooth, coordinated movement, you would be able to start on one dot and have a relatively straight line to the other. Somebody with cerebellar disorder, however, will have uncoordinated movement, and their line might look something like this. Not only is the line not smooth and controlled, but you can see it even went beyond the target and the person had to come back. This is characteristic of disorders either of the cerebellum or of its inputs or outputs. Another example would be closing your eyes and bringing your finger to your nose. You should be able to bring your finger to your nose and touch the tip of your nose each time, nice and smooth and coordinated. But somebody who has a problem with their cerebellum or with its inputs or outputs may find that they miss their nose and instead touch another part of their face, or even miss their face altogether. And in bringing the finger to the nose, there's a very wiggly wobbly course. The cerebellum has two hemispheres that are connected together by a central structure called the vermis. Each hemisphere has three anatomical lobes. An anterior lobe, which despite its name is actually located more superiorly. The posterior lobe, which is the largest of the three lobes. It has a special area on the inferior medial aspect, which is known as the tonsil. It looks like kind of a little outcropping of the lobe. And the part of the vermis that it is associated with is known as the uvula. So just like in the back of your throat, you have tonsils on either side with the uvula in the middle, that little thing that hangs down in the middle in the back of your throat. The same terms are used for this portion of our posterior lobe and the associated area of the vermis that connects the two tonsils. The third lobe is the flocculonodular lobe. This one is kind of tucked up and underneath the posterior lobe and touches the brainstem. We will be able to see the flocculus, which is the hemisphere portion of this lobe on the brains in the lab. The vermal portion that connects the two flocculi is known as the nodulus. So together they call this the flocculonodular lobe. Note the vermis itself is not a lobe. It is a connecting structure in between the two hemispheres. Each hemisphere of the cerebellum controls the ipsilateral side of the body. So if there is an injury to one hemisphere of the cerebellum, you will see symptoms on the ipsilateral side of the body. Here we have an image of a mid-sagittal section of the brain. We can see in the green dots the posterior lobe of the cerebellum. Where the red stripes are on the underside of the fourth ventricle, that would be the nodulus portion of the vermis, so the central structure, which would connect the two flocculus, the flocculi on either side. So that would be part of our flocculonodular lobe. And then at the top, we have the anterior lobe, even though it really looks to be positioned more superiorly. I cannot explain why they've named these anterior and posterior, although there is a slight anterior-posterior dimension, rather than superior and inferior, which seems to make more sense in my head. In the previous couple of slides, we were talking about anatomical divisions of the cerebellum. I now want to talk about functional subdivisions of the cerebellum. First, let me mention that our two cerebellar hemispheres can be subdivided into a medial portion and a lateral portion. The medial portion is smaller and it's adjacent to the vermis. The lateral portion would be the remainder of the hemisphere and is much larger. Remember that our hemispheres consist of our anterior and posterior lobes. The anatomical flocculonodular lobe, which you'll recall includes the flocculus plus the nodulus portion of the vermis, is functionally known as the vestibulocerebellum. It has extensive connections with the vestibular system and is very important in balance and posture, equilibrium, and gaze control. The medial hemisphere plus the remainder of the vermis, so everything in the vermis with the exception of that nodulus, is known functionally as the spinocerebellum. This portion of the cerebellum, the majority of the vermis, and the most medial portion of the hemisphere, receives all those inputs from our posterior spinocerebellar tract and our cuneo-cerebellar pathway. And then we have the large lateral hemisphere, which is functionally known as the cerebrocerebellum. This particular area has extensive connections with the cerebrum. Here is a picture showing the various areas of the cerebellum. So we can see the vermis is the central portion. And this one is, we are just looking on the left side here. So the central portion being the vermis. And then we have here what she calls intermediate. In many places they will call this the medial hemisphere. So the intermediate zone is the same thing as the medial hemisphere. And then we have the larger portion, the lateral hemisphere. You can see how these include both anterior and posterior lobes. If we take that vermis plus the intermediate zone or the medial hemisphere, that together equals the spinocerebellum. The lateral portion of the hemisphere is the cerebrocerebellum. And then what we can't see on this particular image, tucked up and underneath, would be the flocculus and the nodulus, our flocculonodular lobe, making up functionally the vestibulocerebellum. The vermis receives input from the contralateral cerebellum, the ipsilateral spinal cord, and the contralateral inferior olive. It's important in adjusting motor activity in the proximal limbs, basically the girdle muscles, and our axial muscles. The vestibulocerebellum, as I mentioned, has extensive connections with the vestibular system. It has extensive networks with our vestibular nuclei and adjusts those vestibular reflexes. The functional spinocerebellum, made up of the vermis and the medial hemisphere, receives its inputs from the same place as the vermis. That makes sense since it's all part of the functionally the same division of the cerebellum. So it receives input from the contralateral cerebellum, the ipsilateral spinal cord, and the contralateral inferior olive. It adjusts motor activity in the limbs except the hands, ankles, and feet. So the vermal portion of our spinocerebellum is involved with axial muscles and proximal control, whereas when we add in the medial hemisphere, we're now also adjusting motor activity in the more proximal portions of the limbs, really everything except the most distal regions, the hands, ankles, and feet. The cerebrocerebellum, also known as the lateral hemisphere, is the primary input for projections from the contralateral cerebral hemisphere. This occurs through a group of nuclei located in the pons, appropriately called the pontine nuclei. It also gets input from the contralateral inferior olive. In essence, the premotor cortex, which is in the cerebral hemisphere and is responsible for initiating movement or giving signals that we are about to move, that sends information down to the contralateral lateral hemisphere of the cerebellum, which then determines the timing and sequencing of muscle contraction and relaxation in order to achieve our movement. That is going to then go back up to the cerebrum to give directions to our lateral cortical spinal tract for the appropriate excitation sequencing. Our spinocerebellum is going to get input from our proprioceptors telling us how we're doing with the movement and allowing us to make adjustments as the movements happen. So if we are starting to get off target, the spinocerebellum, knowing what we are supposed to be doing, will recognize that we are getting off target and will rapidly adjust the movement to keep it smooth and on task. The cerebrocerebellum, unlike the spinocerebellum, adjusts motor activity in the limbs, including the most distal segments, the hands and the feet. There are 3 peduncles associated with the cerebellum: an inferior cerebellar peduncle, a middle cerebellar peduncle, and a superior cerebellar peduncle. Inputs going to the cerebellum exceed output from the cerebellum by about 3 to 1. So the cerebellum gets a lot of information and then integrates it before sending output. And there's a lot more input for it to integrate than the output that is required to help control the coordination of the movement. We've talked a bit about the inferior cerebellar peduncle. That is how the olive gets its information to the contralateral cerebellum. That's also how our cuneo-cerebellar pathway and our posterior spinocerebellar pathway get their information into the cerebellum. We'll find out that the vestibular nuclei also send input through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So lots of information coming into the cerebellum, into that inferior cerebellar peduncle. So as I mentioned, it carries afferent information from pretty much everywhere with the exception of our pontine nuclei. It is located at the rostral portion of the medulla at the pontomedullary junction. The middle cerebellar peduncle is the largest of the 3 peduncles. It's huge, and we can see this readily on either side of the pons. It carries information from the contralateral pontine nuclei. So information from the right pontine nuclei, those neurons have their axons going through the middle cerebellar peduncle to enter the left cerebellar hemisphere. And then we have the superior cerebellar peduncle, which is at the basically the junction of the pons and the midbrain. And this is where most of the output from the cerebellum goes. So input comes in through the inferior and middle, and the cerebellar output goes out of the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle. The majority of the cerebellar efferents go to the red nucleus in the midbrain, as well as nuclei in the thalamus, known as the ventrolateral and ventral anterior nuclei, or VL and VA. There are many very complex connections in the cerebellum. Basically, input comes in, it is integrated and projected to nuclei that are deeply located in the cerebellum. You will not have to know the different nuclei or which part of the cerebellum they are associated with. Just know that there's these cerebellar nuclei deep within the cerebellum that takes the information and sends the output out that superior cerebellar peduncle. Here's a summary of the input into the cerebellum. We have the spinocerebellum, made up of the majority of the vermis, plus the medial hemisphere. You can see here it's also known as the paravermis because it's next to the vermis. And as we saw in a previous slide, it's also known as the intermediate zone. I will tend to call it the medial hemisphere. But you might see any of those terms when you are looking at different literature or textbooks. It gets its information mostly from the spinocerebellar tracts and the cuneo-cerebellar tracts. Also gets some information from the vestibular and trigeminal nerve, but I want you to know it's getting its information from those spinal cord proprioceptors. This is our unconscious proprioception. The cerebrocerebellum, which is located at the lateral hemisphere, is primarily getting its input from the corticopontocerebellar tracts. This is coming from the cortex down to the pons, to the pontine nuclei, from the pontine nuclei to the cerebellum. And we'll draw this pathway in just a bit. The vestibulocerebellum, which is analogous to our flocculonodular lobe, so it's our flocculus plus the nodulus portion of the vermis. Most of its information is coming from the vestibular nuclei. So these would be vestibulocerebellar tracts. And then all of these functional divisions receive input from the olives. And this would be contralateral olive in the medulla. And as mentioned in that first lecture of this unit, we're not really sure the function of the olives. We just know that if we damage an olive, it appears to the same as if we had damaged the cerebellum itself. How do you tell a cerebellar injury versus an upper motor neuron injury? There are a couple of hallmarks to look for. The hallmark of a unilateral cerebellar lesion is ipsilateral loss of fine motor control without sensory deficit. This person might have a sensation of vertigo, so there may be a sensory impairment within that, but they will not have loss of discriminative touch, they will not have impaired pain sense, etc. So we have ipsilateral loss of our fine motor control, not paresis or paralysis. The person can still voluntarily move. They just cannot do it in a nice, smooth, controlled fashion. The hallmark, on the other hand, of a unilateral upper motor neuron lesion, and we're talking about above the level of the spinal cord now, would be contralateral loss of motor control with the loss of voluntary motor control. So we would have paresis or paralysis as a result. So in one case, we're losing the smoothness, the coordination, but we can still voluntarily move. That smoothness and loss of coordination occurs ipsilateral to the damaged cerebellar hemisphere. If we have an upper motor neuron lesion, so a lateral cortical spinal tract damage or cortical bulbar tract in a few instances, we are going to see contralateral paralysis or paresis. let's go back to the functional divisions and let's talk about more specifically what each one does. I've mentioned some of this, so just to review. The vestibulocerebellum is very important with axial muscle coordination. So we're looking at the trunk, and it's very important for equilibrium and balance. It helps integrate information from a bunch of different places, and it talks extensively with our vestibular nuclei. In addition, the flocculus coordinates tracking movements of the eye, and it is able to suppress a reflex known as the vestibulo-ocular reflex, or VOR. The VOR, if you were to quickly turn your head in one direction, let's say you quickly turned your head to the right, your eyes would move in the opposite direction to maintain gaze on an object in front of you. So if I quickly turn my head to the right, my eyes are going to turn to the left in order to maintain gaze stability on that object. However, sometimes I don't want my eyes to maintain gaze. I want my eyes to go to the right because there was a loud noise over there and I want to see what it was. My flocculus is able to suppress the VOR and allow my eyes to move to the right with my head. The spinocerebellum, the majority of the vermis plus the medial hemisphere or paravermal region, has extensive connections to the spinal cord. It's important in the coordination of gross limb movements. Think the proximal limb, I'm talking the shoulder girdle in particular and the pelvic girdle in particular for the vermis. And more the mid to distal aspects, with the exception of the most distal, hand, foot, and ankle, for the medial hemisphere or paravermal portion. It's very important in gait and smoothness of gait and locomotion. The activity of the spinocerebellum increases during movement because this is our comparator and corrector. So as we are moving, the spinocerebellum is getting input from our proprioceptors as to the movements that are being made, and it is comparing that to what it says we should be doing, and then it makes any corrections necessary in order to keep the movement smooth, coordinated, and on task. It has many outputs to various areas that involve control of more gross motor type of movements. So those medial descending tracts get a lot of information from the spinocerebellum to help control our more proximal and gross motor actions. The lateral hemisphere, the cerebrocerebellum, has significant connections to our cerebral cortex. It is very important for motor learning, and it also stores the sequential components of skilled motor programs. So if you have a skilled motor task, the sequence of muscle contraction that is required is stored here. It does the planning and the programming of voluntary movements, especially important in fine distal limb movements, so really thinking hands, ankle, foot. This is the part that your brain says, I am about to do this. And that information goes to your cerebrocerebellum, who plans out the sequence of movements and timing of the movements and sends that information back up to your brain to carry it out. It is involved with timing and rate regulation. And we see this part of the cerebellum actually becomes active before the lateral cortical spinal tract because it's got to send the planning information to the lateral cortical spinal tract. So it's not really required for lateral cortical spinal tract excitation. There are a lot of things that excite the lateral cortical spinal tract, but it helps to tune, if you will, the order and the timing of the excitations to the different neurons within the tract. Now let's draw out the cerebropontocerebellar pathway. Our premotor cortex tells us when we are about to do something, and it sends that information to the pons, to the nuclei there known as the pontine nuclei. The neurons in the pontine nuclei are excited, and their input goes to the contralateral cerebrocerebellum. They get from the pons into the cerebrocerebellum via the middle cerebellar peduncle. The cerebrocerebellum takes that information, integrates it, takes the information it has stored on motor planning, sends that information to the contralateral thalamus, to the VA and VL nuclei. Those are the motor nuclei of the thalamus. So ventral anterior and ventral lateral. The thalamus, then, those motor nuclei, send the information up to the primary motor cortex, to the lateral cortical spinal tract neurons. And those neurons then descend, cross midline at the spinomedullary junction and the pyramidal decussations, and innervate lower motor neurons in the spinal cord to carry out the movement. What I want you to look here and see is that we have crossed midline 3 times, so that the output at the lower motor neuron is on the same side as the cerebrocerebellum involved in the pathway. Thus, our cerebrocerebellum controls lower motor neuron activity ipsilaterally. Not directly, but by its input to the contralateral primary motor cortex and then the crossing of the lateral cortical spinal tract, cerebrocerebellum controls coordination and smoothness of movement on the ipsilateral side of the body. The cerebellum has non-motor functions. I mentioned this at the beginning. We don't have a lot of information on these functions. We're learning more all the time, but we're still quite limited as to our understanding of these different non-motor functions. We do know the lateral hemispheres have cognitive involvement, and there are a lot of connections via the thalamus to our prefrontal cortex, an area in the front part of our frontal lobes. It also has affective and autonomic functions. This seems to be more in the medial hemisphere region. There are many connections with our limbic structures and with the hypothalamus. It's also been suggested that the cerebellum may play a role in nonverbal communication. To summarize the function of the cerebellum, students have found this to be quite helpful. Imagine yourself as being a giant cerebellum. Your trunk is your midline. That is analogous to the vermis. So if you were a giant cerebellum, your trunk would be the vermis. Therefore, your vermis controls your trunk. The medial hemisphere is adjacent to the vermis. Therefore, it's going to control the parts of your limbs that are closer to the trunk. So the arm and the leg, but not the most distal parts, the hand or the foot. And then the lateral hemisphere is the furthest away from the midline. Therefore, it's going to control the arms and the legs, and in particular, the most distal parts of those limbs, your hand, ankle, and foot. So if you just kind of picture yourself as this giant cerebellum and go, vermis is in the middle, so that's what it controls. The medial hemisphere is going to control the limbs closest to the midline, so closest to the trunk, and the lateral hemisphere is going to control the most distal parts. There is overlap between the medial and lateral hemispheres, so it's not like the medial hemisphere goes to your wrist and stops and the lateral hemisphere takes over. The lateral hemisphere alone does hand, foot, and ankle, but it also does some up in the limbs as well. So there's some overlap within the limb itself, with the exception of the hand, ankle, and foot. The vestibulocerebellum controls eye movement, so basically gaze, as well as balance and equilibrium. So for vestibulocerebellum, you want to think the trunk for your balance and equilibrium, as well as eyes.